Hello, it's Joey, and today I'm going to talk about copyright and specifically how it relates to the world of making and selling junk journals. So this video will also be relevant to you if you make and maybe sell art journals, but I'm predominantly going to draw on my experience from the junk journaling world. So the thoughts and ideas that I present today are really just coming from that. I have 10 key points to share today, and these are things that I really think, if you're in this world, playing in the junk or art journaling world, that you absolutely need to know. And that's because I think it's a fantastic place to play, and if you do understand these basics, then it just clears the path to having so much fun. So this video will be relevant to you if you fit into one or more of the following categories. If you simply create journals because you love the pleasure of doing that, if you make them and maybe gift them, if you make them and sell them, and fourthly, I think this will be relevant to you if you sit on the other side of the fence and you make and sell, or maybe just sell, those products and consumables that we as junk journalers use when we make our journals. So I'm making this video because the topic of copyright and questions about it are the most commonly asked, I feel, when I look at maybe Facebook sites, but also I would say seem to be the most confusing for people. And it really shouldn't be, because it's a fantastic world to play in, and if you can just get to grips with some of the basics, I think you can have enormous fun. In fact, I have been doing this for years and years. I've got over 200 tutorials on my channel for you to watch, and some of those have got process steps that you can use, and I just want you to have fun and play and not be worried about the copyright. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to say that these are definitive answers, because I can't say that. And as always, in a video like this, we would say do your own research. I would also say that if you've got any views and you've got any comments, then please do put those in the comment box down below, because I think we can all benefit. If you've got further questions that others can answer, or you've got some ideas or thoughts, those can be really valuable for all of us to read and see. My approach is to make this video as simple and user-friendly and accessible as possible, which is very much the ethos of my channel here. And although I need to put some text up on the screen, there will be some material from the source legislation and regulations. I felt I needed to share that. I am going to do my best to put it into simple language. I'm also going to get to the nub of the issue and talk about some really specific examples that we come up against in our world of junk journaling. So the questions are often about things like using books, using magazine images, putting together all sorts of lovely goodies and stamping and gluing and putting things into a masterboard, that sort of thing. I've got some material specifically covering each of those. And I'm also going to say I have done work looking at 3 jurisdictions to be as comprehensive as possible. So I've looked at and will share some source material on the UK, from the US and from Australia. I watched lots of videos on this subject before I'm making this one, and I have to say I have a little concern that many videos are not only old, and the world moves on with regulation, but many videos seem to just cite another video, and I just didn't feel comfortable using those videos. So I have gone back to some underlying source material, and that's some of what I'll share today, but I have got my own thoughts and the way that I think about this. So really what I'd like to do is invite you to listen to the end, participate, stick with me, share your own questions and opinions, and let's just get comfortable with what shouldn't be scary. Let's play and have a fantastic time in the world of junk journaling without this getting in the way. So question number one, what is copyright? What does it do and what does it cover? So I'm putting on the screen a couple of extracts, one from the US Copyright Office and one from the UK government website. And as I go through this, I will share as many of the source references as possible. So copyright is just a type of intellectual property, and it's about protecting what I'm showing in yellow here, original works of design or authorship. So there needs to be something original about the thing that it's protecting, and it needs to be embodied in something that can endure for at least a short period of time, and that's why we see the words fixed and in a tangible form of expression. On the lower part of the slide, I've included a short list that's from the UK government website saying the things that copyright prevents other people from doing. And obviously at the top of that, interestingly, is copying your work. And the easiest way to remember what copyright actually does is to just remember that word copy, although there are nuances, and I am going to break that down. It's never easy, is it? It's never that simple. These two sources are from the US and the UK, and I had a little bit of a look across the three jurisdictions that I mentioned, so the UK, Australia and the US. And although the technical material is all presented in quite different ways, I felt there was quite a lot of similarity in the definitions and the scope. So without going into absolutely every single paragraph, I think by looking across those three, I've got a bit of a feel for what copyright is, what it does and what it covers. So beyond copying, you can see that it protects the distribution of copies, whether or not you give them away or sell them. And I'm going to touch on what selling does as opposed to just copying a bit later. There's often a question in the Facebook groups about it doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't sell it, and I'm not sure I quite agree with that, so we'll come to that. Another point that's worth noting there is putting it on the internet, and maybe I'll make a comment about that when we get to the topic of magazines. I've also got some text that's come from Australia. Hello Australia, don't want to leave you out, very important. For Australia, I've put just an extract from the website. I think this is a government legislation website. And again, you can see some of those key words about protecting from reproduction, from publishing, communication of work, or even to make an adaptation. And I think that's quite an important point for us in the world of junk journaling, what that's about. So at a very top level, it's about protecting the owner of the copyright, who may or may not be the original person who created a particular design or asset, but stopping it being reproduced and distributed in some way into the public domain. But copyright doesn't and can't limit the use of everything. I think that's kind of common sense, isn't it? And the US source material gives a really useful paragraph for the sorts of things that are not deemed to be creative, and I've just highlighted a few there. So familiar symbols, you're not going to have a square that's copyrighted. That everybody needs to be able to draw a square, measure a square, write a square, picture down, and you don't want to have colours copyrighted, so you can't copyright the colour red or the colour purple. Copyright is about limiting the use by others of something that has been, if you remember that first slide, expressed, and I said in some form that lasts for some time. So it's not the idea, it's the expression of it that's been put into a form in some way. And that little phraseology has helped me to understand this when we come to some examples like using stamps, so acrylic stamps. So you're not putting the stamp itself in your photocopier, but does using a stamp constitute making a copy? So think about a separation between a design and the thing that it is expressed in, which might be the acrylic. And I think that, to me, is my understanding of this difference between an idea and an expression. You don't copyright an idea, you copyright the expression, and that is what's protected, not the idea. And that's what this little slide is about. I hope that makes some sense. So, getting to the nub of the issue, I couldn't resist producing a little spreadsheet. I am from a finance background. And what I've done here is I've tried to address the question about which of the sorts of supplies that we use in our junk journaling and maybe our art journaling world, and had a think about what makes them risky in terms of copyright. And a point I want to make here is that it's not just the supply or the item that you're using, it's how you use it that makes the difference. So here I've got about 8 or so craft supplies that are commonly used in our world, and I have listed typically what's used. It's not the only way that these items are used, and some examples of how we use them. So I thought it would be helpful to start with, to maybe help you feel a bit more anchored to this subject, if I ran through that list of 8 items and just make a few brief comments on my thoughts about how they might be risky in the context of copyright. And then on the next slide, what I've done is I've just risk rated them, and I can give some reasons for that as well. So top of the list, as you might guess, for me in particular, because I have a lot of them, I did a video recently talking about how many books I have and how I categorise them for different purposes. I use original pages in many projects. I make a lot of my junk journal signatures out of individual book pages, and I make lots of pockets and envelopes. So I might use the thin paper of dictionaries for folding into making envelopes, and I might use scraps of beautiful vintage book pages to do a collage, for example. So books are definitely a supply, and books are probably, books and scrapbook paper, magazine images, those tend to lead to lots of questions about copyright. Stamps, so stamped images are what I'm talking about here. And again, I love using stamps. I use acrylic stamps on masterboards. So a masterboard is a number of layers of paper, and I use book pages for that. I glue paper together, the book pages, and then I put on the top layer lots of lovely different bits of collage. It might be all sorts of scrap paper. I might stamp on them, I might paint on them. I do all sorts of things to create some beautiful collaged images of my own. And so stamps get used in lots of different ways. I absolutely love them, but there's definitely a risk because you are reproducing a design, aren't you? The design is embodied in a bit of acrylic or a bit of a wooden stamp, and then by stamping you're reproducing. But isn't that the whole purpose of the stamp? Let's take a look at that in a second. Stencils allow you to reproduce a pattern by putting paste over the top. I don't use them much myself, but they're great for decorating art journal pages. I have got some, I need to dig them out and use them. Scrapbook paper. So scrapbook paper I think is a little bit different from stamps and stencils. So obviously for scrapbook paper there is on most occasions a design that has been embodied into paper. So it satisfies that phrase that we talked about earlier of putting something original in a fixed form into something that is enduring. So we've got something that's been expressed, it's not just an idea. But I use, as I'm sure many of you do, scrapbook paper because it's a nice design, maybe a nice colour, but I also want the paper itself to be used. So I'm not copying it. The example here is use of whole pages, maybe for pages in a junk journal, or some smaller pieces maybe for collage. And as I go through this video, by the way, I'll do my best to link some other videos in the description box down below, so that if you want to follow through and have a play at using and making some of these ideas up, you've got a video with some tutorial process steps in it to make it easy for you. Digitals and printables, so the same thing. A digital or a printable is something that you can buy. They're pretty low cost typically, and what you get is a soft copy of a design which you can then use to print out on the paper size that comes in your printer. So UK is different from the US, but you can print off some fantastic digital designs, and many of us use those to some extent in our projects. Some of us don't use them at all. I vary. I use a few. I like little elements, maybe on journal cards. I used some fantastic faces recently on some journal cards. They came from Tracy Fox. But I also like doing projects with no printables and just using sort of junk. But they feature a lot in our world of junk journaling, so I'm going to address that today. Pattern fabric, I think about a bit like scrapbook paper. Remember, it's got a pattern on it, so it's someone's design. But when you're using the fabric, you're typically using it because you want some fabric to feature in your project, like on the cover of a junk journal. Pinterest images get used. I don't really play with Pinterest much. I have seen a few examples of Pinterest images being downloaded and used as inspiration for other projects. And magazine images, definitely a subject of discussion on Facebook groups. They are used in whole or in part, a bit like book pages, but because the material in a magazine tends to be a little bit lighter and sometimes the ink can come off, maybe they use less often, but the images can be really pretty. So these are the 8 things that came to mind as things that we used and how we use them. But I'm just going to say they're not the only ways of using these items, and the risk of breaching copyright, I think, or the way I think about it, is it's not just the thing you use but the way that you use it. So what does copyright mean for those main supplies that we've just talked about? Well, the risk of breaching copyright is different for each of them, I think. And my own thoughts are represented by the colour coding, which is a bit of a risk rating really, for the chance of breaching copyright depending on how the supply is used. I think it's easier to fall foul of the copyright rules with some supplies compared with others. So hopefully this is a way of thinking through that issue and getting comfortable. Again, the purpose of this video is so that we can have more fun. Books, I use original pages. I am not copying them, and I'm probably only using 1 or a maximum of 2 pages from a book at a time. And given the definition of copyright, what it covers, I don't think that that's a particularly high reach of breaching copyright. And again, I'm not talking about whether I'm selling or not. I'm literally talking about using the pages. It doesn't matter if you sell. So I've colour coded that green, compared with stamps, which I've colour coded amber, because a stamp is easier to use in a way that does breach copyright. And I have seen videos on YouTube where people have experienced really an unpleasant week or 2 from being told to remove items from an Etsy shop because they used a stamp that they shouldn't have used for selling an item. Stamps come with a license to use them in a particular way. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about something called an angel policy that gives you some exemptions or gives you some parameters for how you may or may not use stamps from designers. So what you're doing when you're stamping is you're reproducing a design which has been embodied in something that lasts for some time, so it satisfies that fixed test. It's not just an idea, it's an expression. And so when we use a stamp, we are often told by the owner of the copyright what we can do, the scope of what we can do with it. It'll become clearer when I talk about angel policy in a second, but it does mean that I think stamps are, in my opinion, worthy of an amber risk rating, as are stencils, which is a bit similar. So stencils are an embodiment of a pattern or a design, and you put that paste over the top, and by so doing and putting it on your paper, you're reproducing the design. Well, weren't stamps and stencils sold to us because we wanted to do that? Yes, they are, but it doesn't mean that they aren't covered by copyright and therefore come with limitations. Scrapbook paper I've put down as amber. Now, there's a curious angel policy I'll share later that even limits the way in which I think we can use scrapbook paper in some projects. But it's only just borderline amber. I think for most of us we would just pick up the piece of scrapbook paper and use it. There wouldn't be any copying done in any way, but maybe it isn't quite green, we just need to be careful. Digitals and printables are very easily shared because they're soft copies basically of designs. Sometimes the creators of digital share freebies as well, but those freebies and the ones that they sell maybe on Etsy are also covered by copyright, and just because they're easy to share doesn't mean that you should do that or are allowed or permitted to do it. What you're allowed to do with digitals is often very helpfully explained at the end of a listing. If you go to Etsy and look up a digital, maybe go to Tracy Fox's site and have a look at the limitations of use that are put at the end of her listings. You can have a look at Louise Heinzel's as well. They will limit what you can do with a digital and how you may or may not be permitted to adapt a set of images, for example. So they are somebody's work and they deserve the protection that they get, and we just need to be careful because they're so easy to share doesn't mean that we should. Pattern fabric is a bit like paper. I don't think we're in the business of photocopying pattern fabric. Maybe we are, maybe some of us do. But again, you've got a design embodied in fabric. And so I put it as green because I don't think it's very common to do, but it is something just to consider whether something is a pattern that you should be copying if that's something that you do in your projects. Now, Pinterest images. Pinterest is probably the most risky, most likely to breach copyright rules, because I don't think people talk particularly much about the fact that those images are all copyright protected. Many of them are photos. Whoever takes the photo has that copyright, and my understanding is that a Pinterest image is protected by copyright, and we're not meant to be reproducing it, so we're not meant to be printing it out and using it. So this is an area where I'd love to have your opinion. I've risk rated it red for that reason, although it is a fantastic source of inspiration if you want to browse through it, so definitely somewhere to go and play. Magazine images are, I've rated amber, and this is a really interesting subject. So magazines, I think, are often different from books. Why do I say that? So images in magazines may themselves not have the copyright owned by the publisher of the magazine. So think about an image of, let's say there's a picture of a stamp, so an acrylic stamp. The copyright for that picture of the copyrighted stamp may belong to somebody other than the publisher, i.e. the owner of the magazine. And so when you use an image from a magazine, you might not be using something that the magazine owns the copyright for. And I think this is the reason why for Daphne's Diary, for example, there is a clear limitation on what they say you can and can't do with those images, because I don't think they own the copyright of all the images, so they can't license them to you for you to do what you want with. And that's a little bit different from books, where typically my understanding is that the book publisher normally owns the copyright to all the images and the text in a book. That is my risk rating and a little bit of rationale behind those craft supplies we use. But copyright doesn't last forever, so I thought it would be useful to just very briefly touch on how long copyright lasts, and is it the same in every jurisdiction. So I'm touching on those 3 jurisdictions again: UK, US and Australia. Going first to the UK, first of all, you automatically get copyright protection, so you don't need to go to some register, put your name on it and describe your asset, your design, whatever it is you're copywriting. You can mark your copyright with that little C symbol that you sometimes see, and You can add your name and the year of the creation, but it doesn't affect the level of protection, which is, I think, worth noting. In the UK, and I'm going to talk really at a high level here, for the sorts of materials that we're talking about, copyright typically lasts 70 years after the author's death. And I put the source of that content on the slide. In the US, it's a little bit more complicated, so I've extracted a paragraph that I hope's useful for answering the question for works created after the 1st of January 1978, which again gives us that death plus 70-year answer. But if it's pre-1978, it gets a little bit nuanced about how long that copyright lasts. So what I've done is put a reference to a really useful PDF if you want to go into that. But the broad brush for the US that I read was the same, death plus 70 years. And the same story holds true for Australia. At a very high level, it's death plus 70 years. But do look, if you want to understand the detail, at the sources that I've provided. Right, point number 6. What is an angel policy? And how does this affect what I can do? A few years ago, there were a lot of videos came out about angel policies, and we all got very interested, and then I feel like the subject has gone away a bit. So I had a think, and having read quite a few, I wrote down my best understanding of a definition of an angel policy, which is what you've got in front of you here. So a copyright owner can choose to set out, maybe on a website when you're buying an item, the things that they want you to do or not want you to do with that asset. And I've got a few examples to share with you because they're actually really interesting how different they are. I've got them in front of me on my tablet, and I'm just sharing the first one here with you from Hobby Art Stamps, which is a UK company, I believe. And in a very simple language, which is very helpful, they're saying something which crops up in many angel policies, which is about the way in which you use the stamp needs to be by hand. So what a lot of the companies will typically rule out is any sort of mechanistic, larger scale use of those stamps, because that would be, imagine if millions of those designs were just suddenly coming off the printing press. Let's go to Stampers Anonymous. Again, we've got the theme of not being able to mechanically reproduce the image, and it specifically references photocopying, computer scanning and printing. Let's go to Ranger. Ranger's got reference to other designers in here. Wherever possible, the Dina Wakely, Wendy Vecchi, Simon Hurley, etc. The copyrights and trademarks should be displayed and or included in works. So do you need to reference the copyright owner in the projects that you create? And then one more, this one was of interest. Remember I mentioned that even the use of scrapbook paper might be limited in how you can use it. I had a look at the Anna Griffin website and the frequently asked questions, and one of the questions was, can I sell items that I make with Anna Griffin products? Again, there's reference to you can create a limited number of handmade original projects to sell at craft shows and other small venues, as long as they comply with the following guidelines in our angel policy. Not mass produced, not over 50. Projects incorporating our designs may not be sold in retail stores or on the internet. So you couldn't put projects using Anna Griffin paper into an Etsy shop and sell it, is my understanding. Just interesting to see how they differ. There's a common theme about not mass production, but if you do have specific papers, or indeed before you buy some stuff, why not take a look at the angel policy and then you know where you stand. I hope this is making some sense and is helpful. If you are finding it helpful, it would be fantastic if you could give me a thumbs up, and also if you've got a friend who you think might benefit from watching this video, share it with them. That would be wonderful too. But let's just finish off with 3 other key questions I think are really worth thinking about when using our supplies in junk and art journaling. I sometimes answer questions on Facebook and reference trademarks, So just because something is out of copyright, so maybe beyond that duration of death plus 70 years, doesn't necessarily mean that you can do what you like, because some assets are trademarked. What I did to try to illustrate this, as you can see on this slide, is just put a comparison up between trademark, patent and copyright. And this is a table that I got from a US website. A trademark, in my understanding, is some sort of symbol or phrase, so it could be just words, that means that in the buyer or the public's eyes they identify with you. So there are examples in the table below. The one that I typically use when I answer questions on Facebook is either Pirates of the Caribbean or Alice in Wonderland. And the reason I do that is because I've found a couple of websites, or I found this website that sets out the protections that the owners of the Alice in Wonderland and Pirates of the Caribbean assets trademark have, and it shows that it touches on things like stationery. So Disney own the trademark for Alice in Wonderland and Pirates of the Caribbean, and what that does is stops basically other people making money from using not just the phrase but any of these projects, any of these products, any of these supplies that present themselves in the market as being, let's say, Pirates of the Caribbean or Alice in Wonderland. So it's just a little heads up that sometimes if you think there is a potential that an item that you're using or might use is trademarked, maybe have a look at that on the internet as well. Google it and see whether you've got coverage there that limits what you can do. Question number 8, I wanted to touch on a phrase that's often used, which is fair use, which is a carve out from copyright protection. That means you can go and do some things with an asset that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. In the US, there are some really helpful factors that are considered when testing whether this fair use concept is applicable. I think it's one of those cases where you only know if you're going to be protected if you end up in a court and somebody says you're okay to do that. So my view is don't rely on these factors or the UK version, which is set out at the bottom, to make yourself feel comfortable that you're okay using a design or a page or an image, but I've set them out here. So I think it's really helpful that there are these factors, and the factors that might be helpful for our world of junk journaling is the amount of the portion used in relation to a copyrighted work as a whole. So does a page from a book really mean that there's a substantial part of a book being copyright breached? I don't think so. And the effect of the use on the market value. So are you actually impacting someone else's revenue stream? I do want to touch briefly under question 9 about some myths that I picked up when I was doing my research for this video, and just to bust a few myths, to be frank. So some of the myths that I read about are that the thing that matters when it comes to copyright breach is intent, and were you intending to do something that was a bit naughty. I don't think, my view, that in this world intent is something which will help you. If you get a nasty letter that says please desist from doing what you're doing, I don't think saying but I didn't really mean to do it or your intent is relevant. I don't think intent is what has come through in the materials that I've shared so far today. Neither do I think it matters whether the copyright breach is a small individual trying to do their best making stamps or a big company. I think the rules are the same, and I think it's dangerous to try to second guess those rules by saying, well, it's a big company and one photocopied stamp doesn't matter. Now, I'm not saying don't apply common sense. I absolutely am saying apply common sense to this world, but I don't think that's a supportable myth that it's irrelevant if the item that you're using or copying is coming from a big company. The myth that I definitely want to bust today is that copyright doesn't matter if you're not selling, because we haven't seen in the literature a protection that you're released from if you're not selling. It's about protecting an asset or something that's created by somebody, something with some originality, from the minute that they embody that in something that's fixed. You don't have to go and register it in the UK, and it certainly doesn't say someone can copy it as long as they don't sell it. And the last myth that I want to bust is, if you see lots of videos on YouTube all saying the same thing, it doesn't mean that it's true, right or valid. If you're really worried about something, contact the company and say, do you mind if I do this? And I've done that in the past, and they're actually really responsive, and you get such a feeling of comfort when you get the answer and you know that you're doing okay and you're safe and you're not doing anything naughty. That's my thinking anyway. If we ask the final question, I guess paraphrase, does it really matter? If I breach copyright, does it matter? Well, morally I think it does, because what you're doing is taking something that belongs to somebody else. However, even if that isn't top of your list of reasons for not doing it, in today's world, who wants a letter to arrive with a load of legal jargon that just scares you and worries you and says don't do something? Or indeed, in some cases, what I've seen is send me some money and I'll go away. And I just think it's a really horrible situation to be in if you're just doing your best and you happen to have not checked something out that you could have checked out very easily, and you get told to take something down from your Etsy shop. Let's just do this let's just have a world where we're happy, we're doing the right thing, we know enough, we don't need to be lawyers, but we know enough to go about this and just play, make, sell a few things and get the buzz when somebody buys one of your journals and it flies across the world to America and they love it. If you found this helpful, then please do give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. It would be fantastic to have you as part of this junk journaling family on my channel. Maybe have a go at one of the projects that I've got process steps for. Those are over on Pinterest for you to download and do what you like with, and I hope to see you soon.